alistando mientras yo presento a Carol. Muy bien. Uno de los ejes de trabajo de este congreso es el bilingüismo, eje transversal para la ciudadanía global. Para ninguno de nosotros es un secreto que adquirir otro idioma, otra lengua, es la apertura mental y emocional a otras culturas, a otras visiones del mundo, a otras mentalidades y a un vocabulario para nombrar las cosas que la hacemos normalmente en nuestra lengua materna. Nombrar situaciones, experiencias desconocidas. Por ello, el bilingüismo es indispensable a la hora de asumir los derechos y los deberes que tenemos todos como ciudadanos globales. Para abordar este asunto y lo que supone en un colegio, hemos invitado a la formadora de maestros, escritora, consultora de enseñanza del inglés y conferencista internacional Carol Lethaby, con la conferencia Los objetivos y desafíos de la educación bilingüe. Carol ha participado en la enseñanza de idiomas desde el año 1986, vivió y trabajó en el Reino Unido, Austria, Francia, Grecia y durante 14 años en México, hasta antes de mudarse a Estados Unidos, donde reside actualmente. Allí, en Estados Unidos, es profesora asistente en la New School Online, Master in TESOL, además de ser instructora de honor en UC Berkeley Extension. Ha diseñado programas de bilingüismo y ha escrito varias series de libros de texto para estudiantes de inglés que incluyen English ID, Awesome, conocido por algunos de ustedes, y Next Step también, publicadas por Richmond ELT. Demos una bienvenida a Carol Lethaby con un fuerte aplauso.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. You'll probably notice something a little bit different about my talk. I'm going to be speaking in English, you probably noticed. The name of my talk is The Goals and Challenges of Bilingual Education. Everyone should have in front of them a handout. And on this handout, you will find all of the main points of the talk in Spanish so that you can follow along as well, okay? And then this afternoon, I will be giving a talk, a workshop, and that will be in Spanish and in English as well, okay? Good. Right, so the goals and challenges of bilingual education then. What I want to do, first of all, is just tell you a little bit about me and my experience with bilingual education. I went to Mexico in 1988 to start teaching English. Before that, I was a French and German teacher in the UK. My fascination, my passion, if you like, is languages. And I love languages, I love learning languages, and I love finding out about languages. Okay, so I worked as a teacher of English as a foreign language. Then, in 1991, I went to work for a private high school called the Tec de Monterrey, which is based in Monterrey, but they have branches all over Mexico. And there, I was the director of the language department. And then suddenly, overnight, they decided that they wanted to change our school into a bilingual school. And so our challenge as English language teachers was suddenly now not just to prepare students to be able to speak more or less social English, but also to prepare those students to be able to study content area, subject matter in English. Then in 1994, I went to work for the British Council in Mexico. And there I worked mainly in teacher education. And that's what I do today still, is I work a lot in teacher education. And you'll notice today that that is going to be my focus, teacher education. I also worked a lot particularly with teacher education and bilingual education. So I used to go to different schools and universities in different parts of Mexico, talking to teachers who were in bilingual education. And I also designed a certificate specifically for teachers who were working in bilingual education systems, okay, and working in bilingual schools. And I've also done a lot of consultancy work in bilingual schools. Okay, a lot of what I talk about today comes from this book too, which I highly recommend to you, Foundations of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, by Colin Baker and Wayne Wright. So you'll see I'll be talking about this, using this book, references to it quite a lot. Okay, this is what we're going to be talking about today. These are the 4 main points that I'll be making, the main areas I'll be talking about. First of all, why bilingual education? So we'll be talking about what reasons we might have to want to teach learners content matter subjects like math, sciences, computer sciences in English. What are the models of bilingual education? So what kind of schools can we have that we call bilingual? We'll be looking then, number 3, at some challenges. What are the objections that people have to bilingual education? And number 4, we'll be considering what are the areas that we need to consider when we're talking about effective bilingual education, okay? And we'll see that a lot of that overlaps with effective education in general. Okay. First of all, why bilingual education? Why would we want to teach students in another language which is not their first language? Why would we want to do that? Okay, to do this, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be bilingual. How many people here, could you just raise your hand if you have ever learned or tried to learn another language? Right, everybody, excellent, great. Okay, so you'll understand, I hope, a lot of what I'm talking about here. All right, the easy answer to this, of course, what is bilingual? Duh, knowing 2 or more languages, right? That's our kind of, our basic definition of it. But what I'm going to argue today, and what we're going to look at a little bit, is that it is more complicated than that. And we're going to consider the question of whether, do you need to know your languages at the same level and to the same degree in order to be called bilingual? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, now Valdez has suggested that it's better to consider bilingualism along some kind of continuum. And what Valdez argues is, if we look at this diagram here, that on one end, we can say we are monolingual. Okay, so for example, in our case, let's take English and Spanish. So on one end, we have monolingual Spanish speakers. On the other end, we have monolingual English speakers. And what Valdez talks about is how we can have all kinds of points along that continuum, okay? And in the middle here, you'll see the big A and the big B. That represents what we call balanced bilingualism, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'll talk a bit more about this. But what's important in bilingualism, and what we're going to see in a minute, is that, as I said, there's more to it than just knowing 2 languages. And you've probably noticed it with your own experiences with learning another language, that your abilities go up and down, depending on how much time you're spending on the language, what contexts you're using the language in. And that's kind of the idea that we're going to be working with, that constantly we're moving along this continuum depending on what we're working on. And as Baker and Wright talk about, there are different contexts for using language. And it's not just about competence in one context. It's about competence over a variety of contexts. Okay, so I've argued then, and I'm sure everyone who's tried to learn a language will agree with me, being bilingual is complicated. All right, so not only do we have different language skills, okay, what do we mean by the language skills? Listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Right. Okay, not only do we have the different language skills, and you've probably found in your own experiences that if you practice reading, for example, in English or in a foreign language that you're learning, if you practice it, what happens? You start getting better, don't you? If you don't practice, what happens? It starts going down. And this is absolutely, of course, clear, isn't it? And particularly when we're thinking about academic study, that if you don't practice, you don't keep practicing the language, particularly in terms of literacy, what do we find? That our skills and abilities go up and down. Now, that's in terms of the skills. We're not just talking about the skills, though. When we're talking about bilingualism, we're also thinking about different contexts for learning language. What are some examples of different contexts where we use different kinds of language and different styles of language? Well, I'll just give you a few. Family. With your family, you have a particular way of talking and a particular language that you use to talk to your family. Okay? That's clear. With work colleagues, you're going to use a different style of communication. With bosses, with people in authority, you're going to use a different style again. For study, for academic reasons, you're going to use different kinds of language in a different kind of way again. Doing business, if you were doing business with someone, again, different kinds of language. Acquaintances, when you meet people for the first time, establishing relationships. Shopping, when you go shopping, there's a whole kind of new way of talking that you have to manipulate, isn't there? Entertainment. Sports and leisure have a whole new range of vocabulary and ways of talking there. Information and communication. Correspondence, using the phone is very different in the type of language that you use from using email. Using WhatsApp is different from speaking on the phone, is different from using email. All right, so we've seen from this then that, as I said, bilingualism is complicated, and it's along this kind of continuum, and we're constantly, this is changing. Over time and place, an individual's two languages or more are never static, but ever-changing and evolving. Okay, so after I've said all this, how complicated everything is it actually a good thing to be bilingual? Well, it would be terrible if I were to stand up here and say no, wouldn't it, when my job here is to come here and tell you how wonderful bilingualism is. So I'm going to say yes, it's wonderful. But it hasn't always been that way. We haven't always thought in that way. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the history of our views of bilingualism. So originally, as you can see from this picture, in what Baker and Wright call the period of detrimental effects, el periodo de efectos perjudiciales, the idea was that bilingualism was dangerous, that bilingualism was a bad thing. And notice the dates. This went on basically up until the 60s. People thought there was something weird about being bilingual. And they thought that it would be very hard for you to be one whole person and that your brain actually couldn't hold more than one language at once, okay? Notice this quotation. This is from a professor at Cambridge in 1890. Unity of mind and character would have great difficulty in asserting itself if you were bilingual. Okay, so that was up until the 60s, as I said. Then, in the 60s, we come into what Baker and Wright call the period of neutral effects, el periodo de efectos neutros. Okay, and what they're talking about here is the idea that there were some studies done which show that actually there wasn't much difference between a bilingual and a monolingual in terms of their intelligence. So this led people to start questioning the idea that we couldn't learn two languages, that it was too confusing for the brain. So people started to think, maybe it could actually be a good thing to be bilingual. There could actually be cognitive advantages to being bilingual. Okay, now that brings us to where we are today. From about 1962 onwards, a very important study done by Pilar Lambert found that there's the possibility that bilingualism actually leads to cognitive advantages over monolingualism. And that's kind of where we are today, that we're in this stage where we think that bilingualism is a good thing. And I want to talk about why I think it's a good thing. Now, what we're talking about here is the idea that being bilingual can be either additive or subtractive. And what I'm talking about here is additive bilingualism, the idea that when you become bilingual, you're not taking something away from someone, but rather you're adding something. This is the idea here. And here, and this is something that I'm going to stress again and again and again, the importance of first language literacy. That even when you are learning a new language, you start learning a second language. In our case, if we take English as the example, you have to continue your development, your cognitive development too, in your first language. And what we know from the research is that the skills transfer. So if you are a good reader and writer in your first language, guess what? You will be a good reader and writer in your second language. 100% guaranteed. Okay, so that's something for us to hold on to, isn't it? To think about this idea that first language literacy is the key to actually being bilingual. Right, now this kind of bilingualism where we have people developing in their first language and then start learning a new language, this usually leads to what we call a less balanced bilingual, okay? So you will get someone who's excellent in Spanish and their English is pretty good as well, right? And that's great, isn't it? That's wonderful. And in some cases, it can actually lead to what's been called a balanced bilingual, okay? Someone who has equal skills in the two languages. But what do we find? This is pretty rare, isn't it? And it's pretty rare if you are living in an EFL situation, such as here in Colombia. Why? Well, because in order to achieve balanced bilingualism, pretty much you need to come from a background where you have two mother tongues that you're using constantly in different contexts and situations. And then you study in both of those languages. Okay, now when we talk about bilingualism and people get afraid of it, what they're afraid of is so-called subtractive bilingualism. This idea that when you're learning your second language, you don't continue to study in your first language. This happens a lot, for example, in the US, where a kid arrives, for example, from Colombia, 10 years old maybe. They're thrown straight into an English language school, no support in Spanish. And while they are learning English, enough English to understand what's going on in the classroom, they missed up to about 2 years of cognitive development in terms of mathematics, sciences, etc. Okay? So this is what we want to avoid. The so-called limited bilingual, it's sometimes called. This idea that you don't get a good grasp of both languages. And what we know for sure is that a less balanced bilingual is much more preferable to the so-called limited bilingual. All right, so we're going to work with then this definition of kind of dynamic bilingualism, that the language practices of bilinguals are complex and interrelated, as we've said. Okay, now the main thing then that we get out of this, and this is something that I want to stress so strongly here, it's essential that learners in an EFL situation, English as a foreign language situation, such as here in Colombia, where you're not surrounded by English all the time, it's not an official language, it's not used officially. They must continue their L1 development, so Spanish development, if we're talking about Spanish-English bilingualism, they must continue their Spanish development at the same time as they work on their English. As I was saying before, because of this idea that your literacy in your first language feeds your literacy in your second language, if you like. Okay, so why bilingual education? Well, basically, two main ideas here. Teaching children in 2 languages from an early age is more likely to achieve balanced or more balanced bilingualism, and consequently, those enhanced cognitive abilities that we've talked about. And secondly, and here's, I think, the key when we're thinking about teaching academic subjects in English, bilingual education, which has a strong academic basis and which focuses strongly on language learning and literacy, can produce people who have strong cognitive abilities in both of their languages and strong language use in a variety of contexts and situations. So here's the problem. In an EFL situation, if we teach learners, say, 3 or 5 hours of English a week, what kind of English, what context do we teach those learners to use? Normally, we teach them so-called social English. They can get by. They can talk about what they did yesterday. They can talk about what they're going to do in the future. They can talk about most things in their everyday lives. But if they never study content matter, if they never study mathematics or history or computer science or social studies in English, then when it comes to those situations, if you only have 3 to 5 hours of English a week, it's very unlikely that you'll get to the level and have the level of practice that you need to be able to study in English. Okay, so what's our objective then? Bilingual education in English as a foreign language situation. What's our objective? Well, I would argue it's this: to produce proficient English and mother tongue language users who can use both languages in a variety of contexts. So in social contexts, academic contexts, and for business purposes, and all those other contexts that we looked at before. All right, why? Well, we've mentioned already possible cognitive advantage of bilinguals over monolinguals, this idea that you're adding something to someone when you give them a second or third or fourth language. This idea of broadening your horizons in terms of culture, if you have another language, you can actually take that language and use it in many other places. Thirdly, of course, here in Colombia and in a lot of Latin America, more job opportunities. We know that if two people are going for the same job, one of them has a higher level of English than the other, who's going to get the job? If everything else is equal, the one with the better English. Like it or not, and we'll talk in a minute about some of the problems with that. And then finally, more study opportunities too. As we'll see, many places now are offering classes, many universities around the world are offering classes in English. We'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so that's our first kind of little discussion then. Why would we want to do bilingual education? Right, our second point, models of bilingual education. What kind of bilingual education can we offer? Well, there are three main types of bilingual education that have been identified by the Colombian Ministry of Education as models here in Colombia. We'll talk about these in a minute. So the enhanced EFL, offering students 10 hours or more of English, so offering them more English. ESL, where students study within the Colombian framework of education, but they also study some of their content area in English. And the third one, a kind of very bilingual system that takes on some kind of international program and standards and uses that. So we've got kind of these three options, and we'll look at those in a minute. All right. Now, if you are going to teach language through content, through a subject, your first question or one of your first questions as a director or a leader of a school like this is, well, what content? What should I teach learners? And there are lots of different routes to take. Some people say math and science, or technology, science and technology and mathematics, for example. Why? Well, because they argue, you know, you've got all kinds of symbols there. It's very specific and exact in terms of the language you use. It's not so hard for learners to learn the new language that they need. That's one argument. Second argument is art and physical education, subjects like this. Why? Well, because apart from language, you have all the movements to help you, you have all the demonstrations to help you, and therefore language learning is going to be easier. And then we've got our third idea of teaching social sciences and literature in English, for example. The issue with these, of course, are that they depend very heavily on good language use, don't they, and fluency. So the argument goes that if you teach social sciences and literature in English, the learners are really going to improve their English because they have to use a lot of English and they have to use it well. Okay, now then, next problem. How do we do it? How are we going to teach English in content areas? Well, we've got two options, haven't we? And I just want to talk a little bit about those two options. We can do so-called CLIL. And CLIL, this is on your handout. CLIL stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. Aprendizaje integrado de contenidos y lenguas extranjeras. Okay? So here you see we have two goals in a CLIL classroom. You're trying to teach learners, for example, mathematics, the concepts of mathematics, but you're also making sure that they have language goals as well. So you're making sure that they know the right vocabulary, the right expressions to use to learn that content. English as a medium of instruction, on the other hand, instrucción en medio inglés, on the other hand, says, no language objectives. My focus as a teacher is content. Okay, so if you do English as a medium of instruction, this means that your focus is just on learning the concepts, on learning mathematics, on learning science, learning computer science, etc. Now, straight away, you should be able to see a problem with this. If you're a beginner learner of English, and you are thrown into a CLIL class, an EMI class, where the teacher is just teaching you mathematics, what's the problem? You're not going to understand anything because it's not in your language. Right, this is why, particularly at primary and secondary levels, we're going to use this kind of model, CLIL, integrating language and content together. All right, so why CLIL? Because we integrate language and content. We often use it in primary and secondary schools to help kids to learn faster. We think that it's faster because they get practice in academic areas, academic contexts, and because it's more interesting. Rather than just studying, hello, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do tomorrow? Those kinds of things. They're actually learning real things in English. And this idea is that it's going to be more motivating and interesting for learners to do that. Okay, so why do some schools do English as a medium of instruction then? Why do they just say, here are our content classes, take them? Well, technology. Here we go. Right, with EMI then, we said the focus is on content, not language. Why EMI though? Well, because, as we've said, it can be a competitive advantage for schools to tell people, I'm offering mathematics or I'm offering history in English. The idea of internationalization and globalization. English as a medium of instruction is seen as a passport to success, if you like. EMI usually refers to teaching at university level and is usually in the private sector, not the public sector. Why? Well, why is it at university level? Because we want to make sure that the learners have the level of English that they need to be able to study content in English. And then finally, parents often consider EMI education as superior or elite. There's something on the screen. Okay. It says that PowerPoint's not responding at the moment, so let me just carry on here. Where's my handout? Can someone check that, please? Okay. Right, what I want to talk about next then are some of the, here we go. Is this working? Oh, okay. I can see what's coming next. Okay, so basically, thank you. Basically then, in terms of English medium instruction or CLIL, what I would argue is that at secondary and primary level, we need to be doing CLIL. We need to be teaching subject matter. If you decide to teach subject matter, you need to make sure that it is integrated with language learning objectives as well. So students have both goals. They're learning concepts in the subject that you've chosen, and they're also learning the language that goes with it, and you focus on both at different parts of the class. Okay, because as Julie Dearden mentions, if teachers don't consider themselves language teachers, if their focus is only on the content, how are the kids going to improve their English? This is why this CLIL model, I think, is very important for lower level primary and secondary learners. Okay. Why teach language through content? Well, we've already mentioned this works on academic as well as social English. It allows students to work on English at the same time as they're learning content, hopefully making it faster. It prepares learners for later when they're going to take subject matters in English in other institutions. And this is important, a way to promote English as a serious subject. In many situations, foreign language is seen as the extra subject, one that's not very important. But if we teach mathematics in English, or if we teach computer science in English, then suddenly English is seen as serious and more important. And the argument is that this is more motivating and interesting for the students. Okay, but, and this comes back to what we've talked about already a couple of times, if learners cannot engage fully with the content because they don't understand the language, then they should not be doing English as a medium of instruction. They should be doing CLIL, content and language integrated learning, and they should be doing it with a teacher who knows both languages, knows both Spanish and English, and who knows how to teach content to a student who doesn't have English as their first language. Okay, so I mentioned before then different ways of doing this. These are some different models that I've experienced in different parts of the world for how to deal with teaching English or teaching with bilingual education. So, you know, ranging from schools who do their program 100% in English, basically with 1 hour of Spanish a day, down to schools which only have 3 or 5 hours of English. And what we find is all of these schools call themselves bilingual very often. All right, now let's look then at the 3 identified by the Mexican Ministry of Education. So we've got enhanced EFL, we've got the English as a second language one, and we've got the international kind of model. Let's just have a quick look at what those are. So English, in fact, enhanced EFL situations, 10 or more hours of English a week, a systematic English program, qualified English teachers, and obviously this is my big interest here, some kind of external certification of the language, some kind of quality control, we'll be talking more about that this afternoon in the workshop, and ongoing teacher training and development. What I'm going to argue is that language teachers, and particularly language teachers in a school that is bilingual, need to be trained and qualified to be able to do this. All right, second type of school, ESL situations, where students are doing some kind of content area also in English, but they often use native speaker textbooks. They're often affiliated to some kind of foreign-based organization, such as the Southern Schools Conference, for example, in the US. They often have some kind of language certification, an external language certification, such as TOEFL, the Michigan test. They use L1 proficiency tests to test their knowledge of maths, etc. And some teaching staff very often will be from the English-speaking context. And they will have 1 or more subjects taught in English, probably using CLIL with content and language objectives, but perhaps with English as a medium of instruction. And there will be extracurricular activities generally in English, such as debate, theatre, spelling bees, things like this. Okay, then, bilingual programs which are international. Okay, they usually have an international program such as the IB combined with a local program. They'll use the baccalaureate, the American Common Core, something like this. They'll use international evaluations to evaluate the learners. They'll have external quality assessment and or inspection. They'll have other subjects, lots of subjects usually taught in English, very often EMI in these situations. And they'll use foreign teachers in combination with local staff. Okay, so these are the three main types that we've talked about then, and we'll have more of an opportunity to develop this and think about this later this afternoon. Okay, third question then. What are the challenges for bilingual education? Why do people sometimes object to bilingual education? Well, we're going to look at this we'll look at a few kind of the different arguments here. This first set of arguments. Is Spanish somehow devalued if learners receive their schooling in English? Okay, this is something I hear a lot when I talk in Latin America about bilingual education. Secondly, do learners somehow lose their Colombianness, lose their identity if they're learning in English? And thirdly, what about indigenous languages? What happens to the indigenous languages of Colombia? There are about, I think, over 70 indigenous languages here in Colombia, with about 850,000 speakers throughout Colombia. So what happens to those if we start teaching everybody in Spanish and in English as well? So that's our first kind of idea to consider. Second group of arguments. Is English given too much importance? Does it somehow become the key to success? Is this fair? And related to this, bilingual schools are then somehow seen as elitist. Now, of course, if you're an owner or the director of a bilingual school, we often see elitism as a positive thing. But of course, there's this other side of it too, isn't there? This kind of more political side of this. All right, the third set of arguments, and this is the one that I'm particularly interested in as working in teacher education. The lack of proficiency in English can cause problems in subject areas. What if a child is not doing well in mathematics in your bilingual school? It's hard to know, is that child having problems with mathematics? Or is that child having problems because they don't understand the English that's being used to teach them mathematics? So this is something that we have to be very wary of. And what we're afraid of course, is that learners won't achieve proficiency in either language. All right, what are the answers to that? We'll have a look after this video. This is a video from the UNESCO. I just want to show you a minute or so of this.
Linguistic diversity is under threat. More than half of the 7,000 languages spoken in the world may die out over the next few generations. This loss not only erodes individual communities and cultures, but more broadly, the very makeup of our societies.
From the moment that the human being was capable of sharing their feelings, everything changed. We see today most of these languages disappearing. We have one bridge left, and this bridge is called culture.
Okay, I'll give you the link so that you can kind of watch this later, but it's very interesting that the UNESCO is very concerned about the loss of languages. And I think as teachers of English and bilingual teachers in English-Spanish education, we need to bear this in mind too and think about the place of indigenous languages. All right, so here are the objections then that we've talked about. What I want to look at next is some of the possible solutions. Okay, possible solutions then to these objections, arguments against bilingual education. First of all, the importance, and I've talked about this right from the beginning, of validating the learner's first language and culture. So my feeling is in a bilingual school, Spanish, if it's a Spanish-English bilingual school, Spanish has to be validated and the culture has to be used as part of the students' learning of English. Secondly, as we've talked about right from the beginning, focusing on the importance of first language literacy. The skills, as I've mentioned, transfer. If someone is a good reader and writer in Spanish, they will become a good reader and writer in English. Guaranteed. Okay, next, promoting and recognizing the importance of another type of bilingualism. Indigenous languages and Spanish bilingualism. This is another important aspect of bilingualism here in Colombia, isn't it? And what we're looking at here is going right back to the beginning again, and this idea that being bilingual is a good thing. Being bilingual adds something to you. It doesn't take something away. It adds something, and I think that's something that's worth reinforcing. The importance of knowing more than one language, not just as a tool, but as a bridge to culture, as the UNESCO mentioned in their video. Okay, as we've said before, this idea, keeping in our minds, this idea of dynamic bilingualism, that bilingualism isn't something that you just do, it's something that takes practice, it takes practice in the different skills, it takes practice in the different contexts, and it's something that is ever-changing. It's not static, your state of bilingualism or trilingualism. Okay, our last aspect that we're going to look at then, and this is one that we're going to explore further this afternoon in the workshop. What are the factors that help to make up an effective bilingual education system? All right, I'm just going to run through the 10 points now, and then in the workshop this afternoon, we'll have the chance to talk about this more. And in the workshop this afternoon, we'll be speaking Spanish, we'll be speaking English, we'll be mixing the two languages together. So I'd love to see you there at the workshop this afternoon to talk about this. All right, what are the factors then? Who are the students? So that's our first thing we're going to consider this afternoon. What is their attitude to learning English? What's their motivation for learning English? What's their background already? And what kind of level do they have? Secondly, Cristina was mentioning earlier vision. And when she said that, I wrote that down immediately. Vision. This is so important, isn't it? That when you start or you're thinking of working with a bilingual school, that you don't just jump in, that you stop and you consider, what is our vision? What is our plan? Why are we doing this? What are we hoping to achieve here? What are our objectives? And that vision and the mission that comes out of it and the goals are then shared by the staff. Thirdly, the teachers. Good teachers. And again, this afternoon, we'll be talking more about this, and especially this idea too, of teacher professional development and training. That being a teacher in a bilingual school necessitates new skills, new ways of working with students who don't have the language that the content that they're learning, they don't have English as their first language in order to learn content. Number 5, the leadership, you people, right? That's why you're here, to think about bilingualism, to think about how you can be a leader in this. And again, research has shown that the leadership is so important, that leaders have this vision, have some kind of mission, and are really supportive of the staff in doing this. And related to this, curriculum. How is your curriculum organized? And as we talked about before, how have you decided what kind of program to have? How have you decided which subjects, if any, to teach in English? Number 7, again, research shows support, the importance of a supportive ethos and environment in the school. Again, of course, a lot of them are connected, aren't they? So if you have this shared vision, hopefully this supportive ethos will come through. Number 8, high expectations. And I'll be talking later this afternoon about what those expectations are and can be. Number 9, individualization. Now, we've mentioned a lot, if learners are having problems with a subject area, is it because they're not understanding English? Is it because they have a problem with the concepts of the subject area that they're learning? Either way, a bilingual school has to have some kind of individualization, doesn't it? Something that's going to help kids who are having problems specifically. And then finally, you probably guessed finally, parents. They're so essential to a bilingual school. So-called buy-in, believing in the school, believing in the mission. Parents have to be with you there all the way, don't they? Okay. We will be talking more about this later this afternoon in the workshop, Effective Bilingual Education. So I'd love to see you there if you're interested in bilingual education and how to go about setting up a bilingual school. What we've looked at today then, we've talked about why bilingual education. We've considered what the reasons could be for bilingual education, ranging from cognitive advantages to the idea of learning language in different contexts, being able to use language in different contexts. We've talked about models of bilingual education, whether you want to just do more English as a foreign language or actually set up some kind of curriculum where you're teaching content area in English. And we've talked about the challenges for bilingual education, some of the objections that people had for us to think about, and to think about what the solutions or responses are to those challenges. And then finally, we've talked about some of the aspects that go into making effective bilingual education. That, as I said, we will continue to talk about in the workshop later this afternoon. Okay, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Santillana Compartilla, and particularly to Andres for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here in Colombia again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol.